The silence of the Nevada desert was not empty, it was heavy, a physical weight pressing down on the asphalt, broken only by the dry hiss of the wind through the sagebrush and the ragged, panic-edged breathing of Julian Vance. He stood on the shoulder of Route 66, a solitary figure encased in black and neon yellow lycra, looking down at a machine that was worth more than the average American car, now reduced to a piece of motionless sculpture. The heat was a tangible enemy, a shimmering wall of distortion that rose from the tarmac, turning the horizon into a liquid blur of oil and dust. It was 104 degrees in the shade, and there was no shade. Julian wiped a mixture of sweat and road grit from his eyes, his Oakley sunglasses dangling from one hand, the other gripping the handlebars of the Velocite X9 so tightly his knuckles were white. He stared at the rear derailleur. It was a tragedy of geometry. A stray rock, kicked up by a passing semi-truck 5 minutes ago, or was it an hour? Time had begun to warp in the heat, had struck the precise, vulnerable point where the derailleur hanger connected to the carbon fiber frame. The impact had been metallic and sickening, a sharp crack that sounded like a bone breaking. Now, the delicate cage of the electronic shifting mechanism was twisted inward, jamming the chain against the cassette. The pristine, ceramic speed chain, designed to transfer power with zero loss, was now a mangled snarl of steel links biting into the expensive carbon stays. Unbelievable, Julian whispered, the word evaporating instantly in the dry air. He kicked the gravel, sending a spray of stones into the brush. Unbelievable. He checked his wrist computer. Heart rate, 110 and rising, not from exertion, but from a cocktail of fury and creeping fear. The Wolf Creek Classic was 48 hours away. This was his final tune-up ride, a solitary 100-mile push to acclimatize his body to the extreme conditions. He was the lead rider for Team Aerodyne. He was the man the engineers had built this bike for. He was the algorithm made flesh, the man who produced what's like a generator. He was not someone who got stranded on the side of a dead highway in the middle of nowhere. He tapped his earpiece again, for the 10th time. Team car, this is Vance. Come in. I have a mechanical. Sector 4. Do you copy? Mark? Steve? Static. Just the white noise of the universe. The support vehicle, a roving workshop filled with spare wheels, ice chests, and mechanics who treated him like a fragile deity, had dropped back 40 minutes ago to deal with a puncture. They were supposed to catch up. They should have been here. But out here, in the dead zones between the jagged peaks of the forgotten West, signals died and GPS failed. He was alone. Julian crouched down, ignoring the heat radiating off the blacktop that threatened to melt the soles of his cleated shoes. He tried to pull the derailleur cage back. It wouldn't budge. The hanger was bent titanium, it required leverage and tools, not bare fingers slippery with sunscreen. If he forced it, the carbon dropout would snap, and the frame would be trash. He stood up, feeling a wave of dizziness. He grabbed his water bottle. Empty. He threw it into the ditch in a fit of childish temper, immediately regretting the expenditure of energy. The road stretched out in both directions, a gray ribbon slicing through a landscape that didn't care about aerodynamics or drag coefficients. To his left, red rocks jutted up like broken teeth. To his right, an endless expanse of scrubland. He was a creature of controlled environments, wind tunnels, altitude chambers, massage tables. Here, he was just soft meat drying out in the sun. He had no choice. He couldn't wait. If the team car had taken a wrong turn at the junction, they might be hours away. He had to move. Julian shouldered the bike. It weighed only 6.8 kilograms, the UCI legal minimum, but as he began to walk, the awkward shape of it, the way the pedal dug into his spine, made it feel like a cross. His carbon-soled cycling shoes, designed for rigid power transfer, were terrible for walking. They had no heel, forcing him to waddle like a duck, the plastic cleats clicking loudly on the pavement. Click-clack. Click-clack. The sound was pathetic, a rhythmic reminder of his helplessness. 10 minutes turned into 20. The sweat on his skin stopped dripping and started crusting into salt. His mind began to drift, cycling through the pressure that awaited him at Wolf Creek. The contract renewal. The whispers in the peloton that Vance was past his peak, that the younger Colombian climbers were hungrier, lighter, faster. He had demanded the Velocite X9. He had pushed the engineering team to shave off every gram of paint, every excess millimeter of material. He had told them he needed a weapon. And now, the weapon was dead weight, and the knight was walking in clown shoes. Then, through the heat haze, a shape materialized. At first, Julian thought it was a hallucination, a mirage conjured by his dehydrated brain. It looked like a shipwreck stranded in the desert. As he limped closer, the shape resolved into a building. It was a structure that defied modern zoning laws and possibly gravity. The wood was bleached silver by decades of UV exposure. The roof was a patchwork of rusted corrugated iron and mismatched shingles. A single gas pump stood out front, an ancient analog relic with a glass globe top that looked like it hadn't dispensed fuel since the Carter administration. Above the open bay door hung a sign, hand-painted on a piece of plywood that swung lazily on one rusted chain, creaking in the hot breeze, "Miller's Fix and Go, Gas and Repair." Julian stopped, his chest heaving. It looked abandoned. It looked like the set of a horror movie where the city slicker goes missing. But then he heard a sound, not the wind, but a rhythmic, metallic clank 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 coming from the shadows of the garage. It was the sound of industry. Of life. He adjusted the bike on his shoulder, wincing as the pedal dug into a bruise, and hobbled toward the sanctuary. The transition from the blinding sunlight to the interior of the garage was jarring. Julian blinked, his pupils dilating, struggling to adjust to the gloom. The air inside was cooler, thick with the heavy, masculine perfume of old motor oil, stale gasoline, and oxidized rubber. It was a smell that belonged to a different era, far removed from the sterile, ozone-scented labs of Aerodyne. The garage was a chaotic museum of mechanical history. Shelves overflowed with parts that couldn't possibly be organized, alternators, fan belts, jars of screws, spark plugs black with carbon. In the center of the concrete floor, which was stained with a century of leaks, sat a massive, rusted red tractor, its engine block exposed like open heart surgery. And beneath it, a pair of legs protruded. The legs were clad in denim overalls, faded almost to white at the knees, ending in heavy, oil-stained work boots. "Hello?" Julian called out. His voice cracked, dry and brittle. He cleared his throat and tried to summon the authoritative tone he used with his mechanics. "Is anyone working here? I have an emergency." The clanking stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with dust motes dancing in the shafts of light that pierced through the gaps in the wooden walls. Slowly, the legs shifted. A creeper rolled out from under the tractor with the groan of dry casters. The man who sat up was a geological formation in human form. He was old, though how old was impossible to say. His face was a landscape of deep canyons and ridges, skin tanned to the color of cured leather. He had a shock of wild white hair tied back with a piece of greasy twine, and a beard that looked like steel wool. He wiped his hands on a rag that was already black with grease, leaving streaks of grime on his forearms. But it was his eyes that caught Julian off guard. Beneath bushy white brows, they were a piercing, electric blue, sharp, clear, and utterly unimpressed. The old man didn't speak immediately. He just looked at Julian. He looked at the spandex kit with the corporate logos plastered over every inch. He looked at the sleek, alien geometry of the bike on Julian's shoulder. He looked at the ridiculous shoes. "I need an Allen key set," Julian blurted out, defensive under the scrutiny. "Metric. And a stand, if you have one. But don't touch the bike. Just point me to the tools." The old man blinked slowly. He stood up, his joints popping audibly, unfolding to a height that surprised Julian. He was tall, lean, and wired with the kind of ropey muscle that comes from a lifetime of wrestling iron. "You look like a neon sign that fell off a truck," the old man rasped. His voice was deep, gravelly, sounding like tires rolling over crushed stone. "I'm a professional cyclist," Julian snapped, lowering the bike gently to the concrete floor, wincing as the carbon clicked against the hard surface. "My team car is lost. I have a bent hanger. I need to realign it. Do you have a 5mm hex key or not?" The old man, Miller, ignored the question. He walked slowly around the counter, wiping his hands again, though it seemed to make no difference. He approached the bike with a slow, deliberate gait. Julian instinctively stepped between the man and the machine, holding out a hand. "Serious, old-timer. This is a $25,000 prototype. High-modulus carbon fiber. One scratch and the structural integrity is compromised. Just give me the tool." Miller stopped. He looked at Julian's hand, then up at his face. A small, dry smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, hidden in the beard. 25,000. Miller repeated. He looked at the bike again. "Doesn't look like it's worth a dime right now. Looks like it's dead." "It's not dead. It's misaligned," Julian corrected, his patience fraying. The electronic shifting entered crash protection mode. "I just need to reset the hanger geometry." "Geometry," Miller muttered, tasting the word like it was sour milk. He stepped around Julian, moving with a surprising fluidity. Before Julian could react, the old man squatted down next to the rear wheel. "Hey! I said don't." "Hush," Miller said. The command was soft, but it had the weight of an anvil. Julian froze. Miller didn't touch the bent metal. He didn't touch the derailleur. He reached out with a finger that looked like a gnarled root and plucked a single spoke on the rear wheel. Pieing. The sound hung in the quiet garage. It was a high, thin note, slightly discordant. Miller frowned. He spun the crank backward. The chain rattled and skipped, a horrible grinding noise of metal on metal. Crunch click grind. "She's hurting," Miller whispered. Julian blinked, confused by the shift in tone. "What?" "The bike," Miller said, looking up, his blue eyes locking onto Julian's. "She's crying. Screaming, actually. You've been riding her hard, haven't you? Wringing her neck. It's a machine." Julian shouted, the stress finally boiling over. "It doesn't have feelings. It has tolerance levels and torque specs. Look, if you don't have the tools, just tell me so I can start walking again." Miller stood up slowly. He tossed the dirty rag onto a workbench piled high with scrap metal. He didn't look at the door. He looked deep into the dark corners of the shop, as if consulting with the ghosts of machines past. "You think because you bought it, you own it?" Miller asked quietly. "You think because it's made of plastic and batteries, it doesn't have a soul? That's why you're walking, son. Not because of a rock." He walked over to a wooden toolbox that looked older than the building itself. He opened the drawers, the sound of sliding wood filling the space. "Sit down," Miller commanded, pointing to a stack of old tires in the corner. "I'm not sitting. I'm fixing my bike and leaving." "You touch that bike with that anger in your hands, and you'll break it for good," Miller said, pulling out a set of tools that looked like they belonged to a watchmaker, not a mechanic. Small, precise, worn smooth by years of use. "Sit down. Drink some water from the cooler over there. It's warm, but it's wet." Julian hesitated. He looked at the bike, lying pathetic and broken. He looked at the endless, heat-blasted road outside. Then he looked at Miller, who was now kneeling beside the machine with the reverence of a priest at an altar. Defeated, Julian slumped onto the tires. He watched as the old man's large, rough hands hovered over the delicate mechanism, about to perform surgery with instruments that looked like they were forged in the last century. Julian wanted to look away, terrified of what was about to happen, but he couldn't. The scene was mesmerizing. The silence of the garage deepened, waiting for the first turn of the wrench. The transition from the blinding, white-hot violence of the Nevada sun to the interior of the garage was not immediate. It was a physical shock, a plunge into a subterranean world that left Julian Vance blinking, his vision swimming in a sea of purple and gray afterimages. For a long moment, he stood paralyzed in the doorway, the Velocite X9 resting awkwardly on his shoulder, his cleated shoes slipping slightly on a concrete floor that felt slick with the accumulated grease of half a century. The silence inside was heavy, a tangible weight that pressed against his eardrums, distinct from the vast, empty silence of the desert outside. This was a crowded silence. It was the silence of dormant machinery, of metal resting in the dark, of dust settling on surfaces that hadn't been touched since the Nixon administration. The air here was cooler, yes, but it was thick. It tasted of oxidized iron, stale tobacco smoke, and the sweet, cloying scent of hydraulic fluid that had long ago turned to jelly. It was the smell of a time capsule that had been sealed tight and left to ferment. "Hello." Julian's voice cracked, sounding pathetically thin in the cavernous space. He cleared his throat, trying to summon the command he used when barking orders at his team soigneurs. "Is anyone here? I have a mechanical emergency." No answer. Only the faint, rhythmic drip of a leaky pipe somewhere in the shadows, counting down the seconds of his wasted time. Julian lowered the bike carefully, wincing as the carbon fiber frame made a hollow clack against a workbench that was cluttered with the detritus of a lifetime of tinkering. He scanned the room as his eyes finally adjusted to the gloom. It was a cathedral of rust. The walls were lined with wooden shelves that bowed under the weight of alternators, fan belts, and jars filled with screws that had fused together into solid lumps of iron. High up in the rafters, dusty light filtered through gaps in the corrugated roof, illuminating floating motes of dust that danced like suspended gold. In the center of the bay, dominating the space like a sleeping prehistoric beast, sat a massive red tractor. It was an international harvester, probably from the 50s, its engine cowling removed to reveal a heart of cast iron so complex and heavy it seemed impossible that it had ever moved. And beneath it, a pair of legs. They were clad in denim overalls that had been washed so many times they were the color of the pale desert sky, stained black at the knees. Heavy work boots, the leather cracked and scarred, pointed toes up toward the ceiling. "Excuse me," Julian stepped forward, his cleats clip-clopping on the concrete like a tap dancer in a library. "Sir. I need help." The legs didn't move. For a second, a cold spike of dread hit Julian's stomach. Was the man dead? Had he just walked into a tomb? Then, a sound. A metallic clank of a wrench hitting the floor, followed by a groan that sounded like tectonic plates shifting. The legs kicked out, pushing against the floor, and a creeper rolled slowly out from the darkness of the undercarriage. The man who emerged was not merely old, he was weathered in the way a canyon wall is weathered. His face was a landscape of deep fissures and ridges, tanned to the color of cured tobacco. He had a shock of wild white hair that looked like it had been styled by a tornado, tied back with a piece of greasy twine. His beard was a thicket of steel wool. But it was his eyes that pinned Julian to the spot. Beneath bushy, overhanging brows, they were a shocking, piercing electric blue, clear, sharp, and utterly devoid of the clouded haziness of age. They were eyes that had spent a lifetime looking at small details in bad light. The old man lay on the creeper for a moment, wiping his hands on a rag that was arguably dirtier than his hands were. He looked Julian up and down, starting from the neon yellow helmet, down the tight lycra jersey plastered with sponsor logos, past the shaved legs, to the carbon-soled shoes. "You look like a tropical bird that got lost," the old man rasped. His voice was deep, gravelly, a sound that seemed to come from the bottom of a well. "I'm a cyclist," Julian said, defensive instinct kicking in immediately. "I'm with Team Aerodyne. We're training for the Wolf Creek Classic." "Aerodyne," the man repeated, rolling the word around in his mouth like it was a stone. He spat to the side. "Sounds like a hairspray." He sat up, his joints popping with a sound like dry twigs snapping. He didn't stand immediately. He just sat on the creeper, staring at Julian with an expression that sat somewhere between amusement and annoyance. "I have a situation," Julian pressed, gesturing to the bike leaning against the bench. "Support car is lost. No signal. I hit a rock about a mile back. Derailleur hanger is bent. The shifting is dead. I just need a tool. I don't need you to do anything, I just need a 5mm hex key and maybe a stand if you have one. Do you have metric tools?" The old man stood up then, unfolding his frame slowly. He was surprisingly tall, lean and ropey, built of sinew and bone rather than bulk. He walked past Julian as if the cyclist wasn't there, heading toward a rusted utility sink in the corner. "Metric," the man muttered. "American road, American dirt, but you bring a metric bike. Typical." "It's the industry standard," Julian snapped, his patience fraying under the heat and the old man's lethargy. "Look, I have cash. I'll pay for the rental of the tool. $20. For 5 minutes." The old man turned on the tap. Brown water sputtered out, then cleared. He began to scrub his hands with a block of abrasive soap, taking his time, methodically working the grease out of his knuckles. "Money's no good here, son," he said over the rushing water. "Gas pump's been dry since '08. Don't sell snacks. Just fix what's broken." "Exactly. My bike is broken. I need to fix it." "Then bring it here," the man ordered, drying his hands on a towel that hung from a nail. "Let's see the patient." Julian hesitated. He looked at the old man's hands, rough, calloused, scarred, with fingernails permanently rimmed in black oil. Then he looked at the Velocite X9. It was a prototype. The carbon layup was experimental. The paint alone cost more than this entire building. "I'd prefer to handle it myself," Julian said stiffly. It's delicate. High modulus carbon fiber. If you over-torque the bolts, you crack the matrix. It requires a torque wrench calibrated to Newton meters." The old man turned slowly. He walked toward Julian, his boots heavy on the floor. He stopped a foot away, invading Julian's personal space. He smelled of pine soap and old iron. "You think I can't hold a feather without crushing it?" he asked softly. There was a challenge in his eyes that made Julian step back. Without waiting for permission, the old man, Miller, walked over to the bike. "Don't," Julian started, reaching out. Miller ignored him. He didn't grab the handlebars. He didn't grab the seat. He placed one large hand gently under the top tube, finding the center of gravity instantly, and lifted the featherlight machine with a grace that belied his rough appearance. He carried it to the center of the room, near the tractor, and hooked the saddle nose over a suspended chain that hung from the rafters. It was a crude repair stand, primitive and swaying. "Careful." Julian winced. "That saddle rails are titanium." Miller crouched down, his face level with the drivetrain. The bike swung gently in the dim light, the carbon frame gleaming like obsidian. Miller didn't touch the bent derailleur. He didn't touch the jammed chain. He just looked. He tilted his head, squinting one eye, then the other. "She's a pretty thing," Miller murmured. "Cold, though. Looks like a stealth bomber had a baby with a scalpel." "It's the fastest climbing bike in the world," Julian corrected, crossing his arms. "Or it was, until the hanger bent. Now, the derailleur cage is pushed into the spokes. If I shift, it shears off. I need to bend it back to the vertical axis. Precisely vertical." Miller reached out. Julian held his breath. The old man didn't grab the derailleur. He reached past the gears and plucked a spoke on the rear wheel. Ping. The sound was high, sharp, and discordant. Miller frowned. He plucked the next one. Ping. Then the next. Pong. He shook his head slowly, a gesture of deep disappointment. You ride it like this? Like what? Julian asked, confused. The wheel is true. The mechanics checked it this morning. The wheel is screaming, Miller said. He spun the crank backward. The chain rattled horribly, grinding against the cassette teeth. Crunch click grind. Miller closed his eyes as the sound echoed in the garage. He looked pained, as if the sound was a physical blow. It's jamming because the hanger is bent. Julian shouted, exasperated. I told you that. Stop plucking the spokes and give me a wrench. Miller opened his eyes. He stood up slowly and looked at Julian with a pitying expression. You listen to the numbers, don't you? Miller asked. You look at that little computer on your handlebars. It tells you how hard to push, when to drink, when to breathe. It's called telemetry. It's how you win races. It's how you drive a machine, Miller corrected. It ain't how you ride a bike. A bike isn't a collection of numbers, son. It's a tuning fork. It vibrates. It talks. And right now, this one is telling me you've been abusing her. Abusing her? Julian laughed, a harsh, incredulous sound. I baby that bike. It travels in a padded case. It gets washed daily. It has ceramic bearings that cost more than your truck. And yet, Miller pointed a greasy finger at the rear hub, you're choking the life out of it. You've got the spoke tension cranked so high the rim can't flex. You've got the headset tightened down like a jar lid. You're trying to make it rigid. You're fighting the road. Rigidity equals power transfer, Julian recited the Aerodyne mantra. Flex is energy loss. Flex is life, Miller countered, his voice rising slightly. The road is alive. The wind is alive. If you build a wall, the wind knocks it down. If you build a reed, it bends and snaps back. You want to go fast. You have to learn to bend. He walked over to a massive, scarred wooden toolbox that looked like a coffin for tools. He pulled open a drawer. The sound of heavy steel sliding on steel filled the room. I'm going to fix your hanger, Miller said, rummaging through the drawer. But I'm going to fix the rest of it too. Because I can't let a machine leave my shop in pain. It's bad karma. Julian watched him pull out a crescent wrench. It was huge. It was rusted. It looked like something used to repair steam locomotives in the 1920s. Panic flared in Julian's chest. No. No way. You are not putting that club on my bike. That hanger is soft aluminum alloy. The jaws of that wrench will chew it up. I need a DAG, too. 2 alignment gauge. Do you even know what that is? Miller turned, holding the heavy wrench loosely in his hand. I know what it is. It's a crutch for people who don't have eyes. I'm leaving, Julian decided. He stepped forward to unhook his bike. I'll walk. I'd rather walk 40 miles in cleats than watch you butcher a prototype. He grabbed the top tube. Let go, Miller said. It wasn't a shout. It was a command, delivered with the absolute, unquestionable authority of a man who has mastered his domain. Julian froze. His hand was on the bike, but he couldn't lift it. He looked at Miller. The old man hadn't moved, but his presence seemed to have filled the room, pushing Julian into the corner. You walked in here, Miller said quietly. You brought the problem to me. In this shop, I'm the doctor. You're just the anxious parent. Now sit down. He pointed a finger at a stack of old tires in the corner, near a dusty Coca-Cola vending machine. Julian stammered. He looked at the bike. He looked at the vast, heat-shimmering desert visible through the open bay door. He realized he had no power here. His contract, his fame, his VO2 max, none of it mattered to the man in the overalls. Sit, Miller repeated. Defeated, Julian let go of the bike. He walked over to the tires and sat down. The rubber was hard and smelled of dry rot. He felt small. He felt like a child who had been sent to the principal's office. "If you break it," Julian whispered, "my career is over." Miller didn't answer. He walked back to the bike. He knelt down, his knees cracking again. He held the giant crescent wrench in one hand. With the other, he reached into the pocket of his overalls and pulled out a small, unlabeled glass vial filled with a golden liquid. He uncorked the vial with his teeth. A scent wafted across the garage, sharp, earthy, resinous. It didn't smell like a mechanic's shop anymore. It smelled like a pine forest after rain. "Now," Miller whispered to the bike, his voice softening into a gentle croon. "Let's see why you're crying." He touched the wrench to the hanger. Julian closed his eyes, bracing for the sound of snapping metal. He waited for the crunch. He waited for the disaster. But there was only silence, and the slow, deliberate breathing of the old man, preparing to perform surgery with a sledgehammer. Julian opened his eyes. He watched. And as the dust motes danced in the shaft of light falling on the carbon frame, he felt a strange sensation, not fear, but a hypnotic, terrifying curiosity. He was watching a collision of worlds, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if the math was going to win. The silence in the garage was not empty, it was a living thing, heavy with the accumulated dust of decades and the smell of ancient hydrocarbons. Julian Vance sat on the stack of rot-dry tires, his knees pulled slightly toward his chest, watching the old man named Miller kneel before the $25,000 Velocite X9 like a penitent before a strange, alien idol. Julian wanted to look away. He wanted to close his eyes and wish himself back into the sterile, air-conditioned comfort of the Aerodyne team bus, where mechanics wore nitrile gloves and torque wrenches clicked with digital precision. But he couldn't. The scene before him was a slow-motion car crash of protocol violations. Miller's hands, huge, scarred, with fingernails rimmed in permanent black grease, hovered over the high-modulus carbon fiber frame. To Julian, it looked like a bear preparing to perform open-heart surgery on a hummingbird. "You're going to crush the seat, stay," Julian whispered, the words leaking out of him involuntarily. "The wall thickness there is less than 2 millimeters. If you apply lateral pressure." "Quiet," Miller said. He didn't look up. He didn't raise his voice. The word was a flat, heavy stone dropped into the pool of Julian's anxiety. Miller wasn't looking at the bent derailleur hanger. He wasn't looking at the jammed chain. He was running his left hand along the top tube of the frame, his calloused palm sliding over the glossy, logo-covered surface with a disturbing intimacy. He closed his eyes. He seemed to be listening, not with his ears, but with his fingertips. "She's tight," Miller murmured, his eyes still closed. "Strung up like a banjo wire about to snap. You boys. You think stiffness is speed. You build them so they can't move, so they can't breathe." "Stiffness is speed," Julian corrected, his voice tight. "Power transfer. Any flex in the bottom bracket is wasted watts. It's physics." Miller opened one eye, the iris a shocking electric blue in the gloom. "Physics," he repeated, tasting the word and finding it sour. "That's what you call it when you try to force the world to move in a straight line. But the world ain't straight, son. The road ain't straight." The old man reached into the pocket of his greasy overalls. Julian flinched, expecting a heavy wrench or a hammer. Instead, Miller produced a small, glass vial. It was unlabeled, filled with a liquid the color of old amber, stoppered with a piece of cork. "What is that?" Julian stood up, panic overriding his exhaustion. "Wait. You can't put random lubricants on those components. That chain uses a dry wax coating developed by NASA. If you introduce a petroleum-based oil, it'll attract grit. It'll create a grinding paste. You'll ruin the drivetrain." Miller ignored him completely. He uncorked the vial. Instantly, a scent wafted through the stagnant air of the garage. It didn't smell like 10W40 or WD-40. It smelled of crushed pine needles, lanolin, and something sharper, like ozone after a thunderstorm. It was an organic, earthy smell that seemed to push back the reek of gasoline. Miller tilted the vial and let a single, golden drop fall onto the pulley wheel of the derailleur. "Don't," Julian pleaded, stepping forward. Miller spun the pulley with his thumb. Whir. The sound was wet, silent, immediate. "See?" Miller whispered. "Thirsty." He moved to the bent hanger. This was the moment Julian had dreaded. The derailleur hanger was a sacrificial piece of metal, designed to bend or break to save the frame. To realign it required a specialized tool, a DAG-2 gauge, that screwed into the hanger and allowed the mechanic to measure the alignment against the rim to within a millimeter. Miller didn't have a gauge. He had a crescent wrench that looked like it had been used to fix tank treads in World War II. No, Julian stammered, reaching out. "You can't eyeball that. It's an 11-speed system. The tolerance is 0.5 millimeters. If you're off, the chain will go into the spokes." Miller slapped Julian's hand away. It wasn't a hard slap, but it was fast, shockingly fast for a man who moved like a glacier. "Sit down." Miller's voice dropped an octave. "You brought her to me. You walked her through that door. She's mine until she rolls out. Now, do you want to walk 40 miles back to civilization in those plastic tap-dancing shoes, or do you want to ride?" Julian froze. The heat of the day was still throbbing in his temples. His legs felt like lead. He looked at the wrench in Miller's hand, then at the door. He sat back down on the tires, defeated. "If you break it, I'm suing you. I'm suing this whole shack into the ground." "Get in line," Miller grunted. He clamped the heavy jaws of the crescent wrench onto the delicate titanium hanger. Julian held his breath, his stomach twisting. Miller didn't yank. He didn't jerk. He closed his eyes again, his body becoming a statue. He applied pressure slowly, a microscopic increase in force. Creak. The metal groaned. Julian winced. Miller paused. He took a breath, adjusted his grip, and applied pressure again. It was a movement of feeling, not sight. He was waiting for the metal to yield, sensing the exact point between plastic deformation and fracture. It was the way a safecracker turns a dial, waiting for the tumblers to fall. "There," Miller breathed, releasing the wrench. He didn't check it. He didn't measure it. He just moved on. "Now for the voice," Miller said. He spun the rear wheel. The wheel, a deep-section carbon aero rim, spun with a low whoosh. But as it turned, Miller leaned in, his ear inches from the spokes. "Hear that?" Miller asked. "Hear what?" "It's a wheel." "Dissonance," Miller said. "She's shouting. High C on the drive side, but flat on the non-drive. You've got tension fighting tension. It's true to factory spec." Julian argued, his engineer's brain rebelling against this shamanism. High tension on the drive side is necessary to counterbalance the torque of the cassette. It's supposed to be unbalanced. "And that's why it feels dead in the corners," Miller countered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a spoke key. It wasn't the ergonomic, rubber-gripped tool Julian was used to. It was a simple circular piece of steel, worn smooth as a river stone. Miller began to work on the wheel. And this was where Julian lost his tether to reality. A normal mechanic trues a wheel by watching the rim pass through a caliper, tightening where it wobbles. Miller didn't look at the rim. He looked at the wall. He plucked a spoke. Ping. He turned the nipple a quarter turn. Pong. He moved to the next one. Ping. He was tuning the wheel like a harp. "You're detensioning it," Julian observed, horror dawning on him. I can see the threads. You're making the wheel softer. It's going to flex. I'll lose power. You'll gain flow, Miller said, his hands moving in a blur now, a rhythm establishing itself. Pluck. Turn. Pluck. Turn. The road vibrates. If the wheel is too hard, it bounces. Every bounce is lost time. You need the wheel to absorb, to mold itself to the asphalt. You need it to be water, not ice. Julian watched, mesmerized despite himself. The old man's movements were hypnotic. There was a grace to them that belied his rough appearance. It was the muscle memory of a master, someone who had done this a million times, perhaps a lifetime ago. Julian remembered the photo the woman had mentioned, the Olympic mechanic. Was this him? Was this the ghost of 1968? Miller stopped. He spun the wheel again. This time, there was no whoosh. The wheel simply vanished into motion. It spun in perfect silence. The rim didn't waver a fraction of a millimeter. It was impossibly true, yet Julian knew, based on what he had just seen, that the tension balance was completely wrong by aerodyne standards. Now, Miller said, standing up and cracking his back. The lungs. He moved to the front of the bike. He loosened the stem bolts. Whoa, whoa. Julian jumped up. My fit coordinates are set by laser. My reach is exactly 54.5 centimeters. If you move the handlebars, you change my hip angle. I'll lose leverage. You're constricted, Miller muttered, tapping the handlebars. I saw you walking. I saw your shoulders. Rolled forward. Tight. You're riding like you're trying to hide from the wind. You need to open up. It's called aerodynamics. Frontal area drag. It's called suffocating, Miller retorted. He rotated the handlebars upward. Not much. Maybe 3 degrees. A microscopic shift. Then he dropped the stem 5 millimeters, removing a spacer Julian didn't even know was there. You're lowering the front end but raising the bar angle? Julian asked, bewildered. That makes no sense. It cancels out. It changes the fulcrum, Miller said, tightening the bolts with that same terrifying lack of a torque wrench, his wrist snapping with a calibrated click that lived only in his tendons. Now your diaphragm can drop. You can breathe into your belly. The engine needs air, boy. Give it air. Miller stepped back. He wiped his hands on his overalls, leaving fresh streaks of black on the denim. The bike stood on the concrete floor. It looked different. It was the same frame, the same wheels, the same components. But the stance had shifted. It looked less like a weapon and more like an animal crouching to spring. The silence coming from the machine was profound. The chain, Julian said, pointing. You didn't fix the jam. Miller smiled. It was a toothy, mischievous grin. Check it. Julian walked over. He grabbed the crank arm. He expected resistance. He expected the crunch of the twisted chain. He pushed the pedal with one finger. The crank rotated. The chain, coated in that strange, amber-smelling oil, slipped over the cassette teeth like liquid mercury. The shift was seamless. The derailleur, the one Miller had bent back with a rusty crescent wrench, guided the chain onto the big ring with a snick so quiet it was barely audible. It was perfect. No. It was better than perfect. When the mechanics at Aerodyne tuned the bike, it felt precise, mechanical, tight. This felt frictionless. It felt as if the metal parts had stopped being separate components and had fused into a single organism. Julian looked up at Miller. The old man was already walking away, heading back toward the dark recess of the garage where a small cot and a hot plate sat. How? Julian asked, his voice hollow. How did you do that without a gauge? Without a tension meter. Miller stopped and turned. The light from the doorway caught the side of his face, illuminating the deep ravines of his skin. I didn't ask the bike what it should be, Miller said softly. I asked it what it wanted to be. Machines have memories, son. Metal remembers the fire that forged it. Carbon remembers the weave. They want to work. You just have to stop fighting them with your math. Math wins races, Julian said, though the conviction was gone from his voice. Math builds bridges, Miller corrected. Heart wins races. And right now, that bike has more heart than you do. Julian reached for his back pocket, pulling out his wallet. It was a sleek, carbon fiber clip holding a stack of cash and black credit cards. I need to pay you. How much? 200. 300. That was masterwork. I admit it. Miller waved a hand dismissively, not even looking at the money. I don't want your plastic. And I don't want your paper. I have to give you something. You saved my race. Miller paused. He looked at the bike, a look of genuine affection crossing his face, then back at Julian with a stern, almost pitying expression. You want to pay me? Miller pointed a greasy finger at Julian's chest. Then listen to me. When you get out there, stop looking at that computer on your handlebars. Stop looking at the watts. Stop counting your heartbeat. That's how I race, Julian said. That's how you lose, Miller snapped. You race with your eyes on a screen, you miss the race. The wind talks. The road talks. The bike is talking to you right now, but you're deaf. Price of the repair is this: for the next 10 miles, you don't look at the numbers. You look at the horizon. You feel the wheel. You let the bike lead. That's it. That's it. Now get out. I have work to do. Miller gestured to the rusted tractor. Machines that actually do something useful need me. Julian stood there for a moment, holding the bike. He felt a strange vibration humming through the carbon top tube, warmth from the old man's hands still lingering on the material. He wanted to ask more. He wanted to ask who Miller really was, why he was out here in this graveyard of rust, why he had stopped fixing Olympic bikes to fix tractors. But the dismissal was final. Miller had already slid back under the Ford, the clank-clank-clank of his wrench resuming, building a wall of sound between them. Julian walked the bike out of the garage. The heat hit him like a physical blow. The sun was still high, the asphalt shimmering. But as he stepped onto the road, the dread that had consumed him an hour ago was gone. He looked at the bike. The golden oil glistened on the chain. The handlebars sat at their new, slightly odd angle. He clipped his shoes into the pedals. Click. Click. He pushed off. The first sensation was disorientation. The bike didn't feel like his bike. The lowered stem shifted his weight forward, but the tilted bars cupped his hands more naturally. His chest felt open. He took a breath, and the air seemed to rush deeper into his lungs than it ever had before. He turned the pedals. Usually, there is a lag. A microsecond of resistance where the tire fights the road, where the bearings overcome inertia. There was no lag. Julian gasped. The bike surged forward as if it had been waiting for him to move, as if it were anticipating the thought before the muscle contracted. He wasn't pushing the bike was pulling him. He looked down at his computer. Habit took over. He wanted to see the watts. He wanted to verify this sensation with data. Stop looking at the numbers. Miller's voice rasped in his memory. Julian hesitated. Then, with a shaking hand, he reached out and twisted the computer mount. He pulled the unit off and shoved it into his jersey pocket. The screen was gone. Just the road, the bars, and the wheel. He shifted gears. Snick. Seamless. He stood up and hammered. The wheel didn't bounce. It hummed a low, harmonious note, absorbing the cracks in the Route 66 pavement, transmuting the rough surface into a stream of pure kinetic energy. Julian Vance, the man of science, the man of data, laughed. It was a startled, involuntary sound that echoed in the empty desert. He leaned into the wind, and for the first time in his career, he didn't feel like he was fighting it. He felt like he was part of it. He was flying. And he had 40 miles to go before he had to tell anyone the truth. Or maybe, he thought, as the speedometer in his pocket registered a speed that shouldn't be possible, he wouldn't tell them anything at all. The transition from the spiritual silence of the Nevada desert back to the high-friction reality of the world tour was not gradual, it was a collision. Julian Vance rolled into the parking lot of the Wolf Creek Resort, the temporary headquarters for Team Aerodyne, and felt like a time traveler returning from a distant century. The sleek, matte black team bus, a rolling fortress of sports science that cost more than most houses, loomed like a monolith against the twilight sky. Mechanics were already scurrying like ants around the pop-up service tents, the whine of power washers and the hiss of air compressors slicing through the evening air. Julian unclipped from his pedals. Click. The sound was different now, sharper, more definitive. He felt a strange reluctance to let go of the handlebars. For the last 40 miles, the Velocite X9 hadn't just been a vehicle, it had been a conspirator. It had sliced through the headwinds of the valley floor with a predatory grace that defied physics. He hadn't looked at his computer, it was still stuffed in his back pocket, blindly recording data, but he knew. He knew in his legs, which felt suspiciously fresh despite the distance. He knew in his lungs, which felt open and expansive, liberated by the subtle shift in the cockpit geometry Miller had beaten into place with his fist. Vance! Where the hell have you been? The shout came from Marcus Sterling, the team director. Sterling was a man built of stress and spreadsheets, a former rider who had traded his soul for a headset and a monitor bank. He marched across the asphalt, his face flushed. We lost telemetry for 3 hours. The support car blew a tire, lost the GPS lock, and panicked. We thought you were in a ditch. I had a mechanical, Julian said, his voice calm. He was surprised by his own tranquility. Usually, Sterling's shouting spiked his cortisol levels instantly. Today, the noise felt distant, like a radio playing in another room. Derailleur hanger bent. Chain jammed. Sterling stopped, his eyes darting immediately to the bike. He didn't look at Julian, he looked at the asset. You rode it back. On a bent hanger. Jesus, Julian, if you crack the dropout, the frame is toast. That's the prototype. We don't have a backup with the new layup weave. It's fine, Marcus. I got it fixed. Fixed. Fixed where? We're 50 miles from civilization. A shop. Old guy off Route 66. Sterling's face twisted into a mask of horror. He waved frantically at the head mechanic, a German perfectionist named Klaus. Klaus! Get over here. Vance let some desert redneck touch the X9. Full diagnostic. Now. Check the torque specs, check the alignment. If there's a single scratch on that clear coat, I want to know. Klaus descended on the bike like a crime scene investigator. He took the machine from Julian's hands. Julian felt a pang of loss, a sudden severance of the connection, as if a live wire had been pulled from his spine. He watched as Klaus mounted the bike on the repair stand. The bright LED work lights flooded the carbon fiber, exposing every grain of dust. This is. Klaus paused, squinting. He spun the cranks. The rear wheel began to turn. The silence that followed was absolute. Usually, a high-end racing hub makes a distinct, angry buzzing sound, the sound of pawls engaging. The Aerodyne hubs were loud, a signature of their aggression. But the wheel Miller had touched spun with a ghostly, frictionless whisper. It was a void of sound. What did he put on the chain? Klaus leaned in, sniffing. He wrinkled his nose. It smells like trees. Dirt? He oiled it, Julian said, leaning against the side of the bus, crossing his arms. With what? Olive oil? Bear grease? Klaus swiped a finger along the chain, rubbing the golden residue between his thumb and forefinger. This viscosity is wrong. It is too thin. It will wash out. He spun the wheel again. It kept spinning. And spinning. And spinning. Momentum seemed to have no natural predator here. Sterling crowded in, looking at the ceramic bearings. Check the alignment, Klaus. The hanger. Klaus grabbed his digital alignment gauge, a tool that cost $2,000 and used lasers to measure straightness to the micron. He threaded it into the hanger. He stared at the readout. He reset the tool. He stared again. It is perfect, Klaus muttered, the German accent thickening with confusion. 0.0 deviation. Even from the factory, we accept 0.2. This is dead center. Good, Sterling exhaled. At least the hillbilly didn't bend it. But wait, Klaus said, moving to the spokes. He plucked one. Ping. He frowned. He plucked another. Pong. The tension is wrong. It is completely uneven. The drive side is too tight, the non-drive is too loose. It is chaos. But he spun the wheel again. The rim didn't wobble a fraction. How is it true? The math says this should be a potato. Fix it, Sterling ordered. Bring it back to team spec. 1200 newtons on the drive side. Even tension. No, Julian said. The word hung in the air, louder than the compressors. Sterling turned slowly. Excuse me. Don't touch the wheels, Julian said, pushing off the bus. He walked into the circle of light, stepping between the mechanic and the bike. And don't touch the handlebars. Leave it exactly as it is. Julian, Sterling said, his voice dropping to that dangerous, patronizing tone he used when riders got difficult. You are dehydrated. You are tired. That wheel is structurally compromised. If you dive into a corner at 80 km per hour and that spoke tension gives, you die. We follow the protocol. Klaus, tension the wheel. I rode it 40 miles at 300 watts average, Julian lied, he knew it was more. It didn't wobble. It didn't flex. It felt planted. Better than before. If you touch it, I don't race tomorrow. The ultimatum was insane. Riders didn't dictate mechanics to Aerodyne. The team was the machine, the rider was just the engine. But there was something in Julian's eyes, a cold, hard certainty that Sterling hadn't seen in years. Usually, Julian was full of neurotic questions. Is the seat too high? Is the tire pressure right? Tonight, he looked like a man who knew a secret. Sterling stared at him for a long 10 seconds. He looked at the wheel, still spinning silently on the stand, defying the friction of the air itself. Fine, Sterling spat. But we're hooking it up to the dyno. I want to see the drag numbers. If the efficiency is down by even 1%, Klaus rebuilds it, and you shut up and ride. The inside of the team bus was a mobile NASA command center. Screens lined the walls, displaying weather patterns, course topography, and physiological data. Klaus mounted the bike onto the dynamometer, a rolling road that measured power input versus output, calculating drivetrain loss to the fraction of a watt. Julian sat on the plush leather bench, sipping a recovery shake that tasted like chalk and vanilla. He watched the screen. Spin it up, Sterling commanded. Klaus activated the motor. The bike's rear wheel spun against the roller. The computer began to churn out data. The graph line appeared on the main monitor. It was a flat, green line. That's the friction coefficient? Sterling asked, squinting. Is the sensor broken? It's reading near zero. The sensor is calibrated, Klaus said, typing furiously. Input 200 watts. The machine whirred. The readout showed 199. 8 watts reaching the roller. Impossible, Klaus whispered. Drivetrain loss is usually 3 to 4%. Chain friction, pulley bearing drag, bottom bracket flex. We lose 6 to 8 watts on a good day. This is losing 0.2 watts. It's a glitch, Sterling said, pacing the narrow aisle. Rerun it. Max load. Simulate a sprint. 1,200 watts. Klaus ramped up the resistance. The motor screamed. The bike vibrated on the stand, or rather, the stand vibrated. The bike itself remained eerily still, the wrong spoke tension absorbing the harmonics, the wrong oil cushioning the chain rollers. Input, 1,200 watts. Output, 1198 watts. The room went silent. The mechanics, the soigneurs, the other riders who had drifted in, everyone stared at the screen. Physics had laws. Thermodynamics demanded that energy be lost to heat and sound. But the Velocite X9, anointed with Miller's golden oil and tuned by his ear, was treating the laws of thermodynamics as mere suggestions. It's 5% more efficient than the baseline, Klaus said, his voice trembling. It is effectively a perpetual motion machine compared to what we raced last week. Sterling looked at Julian. The director's face was pale. He didn't see magic, he saw an unfair advantage. He saw a lawsuit. He saw the UCI doping control tearing the bike apart looking for a motor. What did he do, Julian? Sterling hissed. Did he put a magnetic drive in the hub? Is there a hidden battery in the seat tube? He tuned it, Julian said softly. He just listened to it. Bullshit. Nobody listens to carbon fiber. Sterling walked over to the bike and stared at it with a mixture of greed and fear. Klaus, X-ray the frame. Check for motors. If it's clean, we race it. But nobody touches a single bolt. Do you hear me? Put it in the truck. Lock the door. Julian, go to sleep. You're going to need it. The morning of the Wolf Creek Classic broke with a violence typical of the high desert. The sun crested the peaks and instantly set the valley on fire. The temperature at the starting line was already 85 degrees. The atmosphere was a carnival of tension. 200 riders, the leanest, hungriest men on earth, were corralled into the starting chute. The air smelled of embrocation cream, expensive espresso, and nervous sweat. Helicopters chopped the air overhead. The announcer's voice boomed over the PA system, distorted and hype-filled, introducing the favorites. Julian stood by his bike. He felt detached from the circus. Usually, he would be checking his tire pressure for the 10th time, adjusting his helmet strap, staring at his power meter to ensure it was paired. Today, his power meter was taped over. He had taken a piece of black electrical tape and covered the screen of his computer. He didn't want to see the numbers. He wanted to see the road. Vance. He turned. It was a rider from a rival team, a Colombian climber named Quintana who had dropped him on this very course last year. Quintana looked at the black tape on the computer and laughed. Broken computer? Or are you afraid to see how slow you are today? Julian smiled. It wasn't his usual media-trained smile. It was the smile Miller had worn when he looked at the wrench. Just riding by feel today, narrow. Feel doesn't climb Wolf Creek, Quintana scoffed, clipping in. What's climb Wolf Creek? The gun went off. The sound was a dull pop, and then the chaos began. The sound of 200 cleats clipping in simultaneously, clack clack clack, sounded like a fusillade of gunfire. The peloton surged forward, a multicolored beast of lycra and carbon writhing through the streets of the resort town before hitting the open highway. For the first hour, the pace was controlled but high. The peloton moved like a school of fish, expanding and contracting. Julian stayed in the middle, protected from the wind. This was usually the part of the race Julian hated. The constant fighting for position, the elbows, the braking, the anxiety of a crash. But today, the bike felt sentient. When a gap opened up to his right, a gap barely 6 inches wide, Julian didn't have to calculate the risk. The bike simply drifted into it. The handlebars, slightly higher and wider than before, gave him a leverage he had never possessed. He felt the road texture through the soft wheels, not as a jarring impact, but as information. He could feel the grip limit of the tires with a clarity that was terrifying. Left. Drift right. Brake feather. It was a dance. Miller's voice was in his head, the wind is alive. Don't fight it. At mile 40, the crosswinds hit. The peloton shattered into echelons, diagonal lines of riders seeking shelter from the gusts. This was where races were lost. If you missed the wheel in front of you for a second, the wind would grab you and throw you out the back. Vance. Move up. Zone 4 power. Sterling screamed in his earpiece. You're drifting too far back. Push 400 watts. Julian ignored the voice. He ignored the burning in his legs. He wasn't looking at a screen. He was watching the grass on the side of the road, seeing how it flattened. He saw the gust coming before it hit the pack. While the other riders stiffened, bracing against the impact, Julian relaxed his grip. The wind hit the bike. Instead of being shoved sideways, the Velocite X9 seemed to lean into the blast. The flex in the wheels that Klaus had wanted to fix absorbed the lateral force, acting like a suspension system. Julian surfed the gust. He shot forward, moving past 10 riders who were fighting their bikes, wrestling with their rigid, aerodynamic machines. He floated to the front of the group with absurd ease. He hadn't spiked his heart rate. He hadn't burned a match. Vance, status. Sterling crackled. The telemetry. Are you drafting a car? Your power is too low for that speed. I'm just sailing, Marcus, Julian whispered into the mic. Then came the mountain. Wolf Creek Pass. 20 miles of asphalt draped over the spine of the Rockies. Average gradient, 8%. Maximum, 14%. It was a graveyard for heavy legs. The lead group hit the base of the climb. The speed dropped. The noise of the free hubs stopped, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the climbers and the grinding of chains moving to easier gears. Julian shifted. Snick. The golden oil did its work. While other drivetrains crunched under the load of 400 watts, his was silent. Quintana attacked. It was early, too early. But Quintana was arrogant. He stood up and accelerated, dancing on the pedals, opening a 10-meter gap instantly. The other contenders scrambled to respond, their faces twisting in pain. Let him go. Sterling shouted in the earpiece. He'll blow up. Hold your threshold. 380 watts. Do not exceed 380. We catch him in 5 miles. Julian looked at the black tape on his computer. He couldn't see 380 watts. He could only feel the fire in his chest and the hum of the bike. The bike didn't want to wait. He felt it in the bottom bracket. The machine felt coiled, like a spring compressed to its limit. It was urging him. Go. Now. Vance, hold position. Sterling warned. Do not chase. That is a suicide move. Julian looked up the road. Quintana was flying, his hips swaying. The logic, the math, said to wait. The drag coefficient at this speed was negligible, it was all power to wait. If he chased now, he would go into the red zone. He would accumulate lactic acid that he couldn't flush. He would bonk before the summit. That was what the science said. But the science hadn't met Arthur Miller. Julian remembered the garage. Machines have memories. They want to work. He shifted down 2 gears. A harder gear. A gear for sprinting, not climbing. Vance. What are you doing? Your cadence is dropping. Julian stood up. He didn't attack with a violent snap. He simply poured his weight into the pedals. The bike responded with a surge that felt like being launched from a catapult. The loose spoke snapped taut, delivering energy back to the road with a slingshot effect. He bridged the gap to Quintana in 30 seconds. The Colombian looked back, his eyes widening in shock. He was gasping for air, his face a mask of agony. Julian pulled alongside him. Julian's mouth was closed. He was breathing through his nose, deep into his belly, his diaphragm unobstructed by the new handlebar position. He looked at Quintana. He didn't say a word. He just listened to the silence of his own bike compared to the grinding of Quintana's chain. Vance. You are 50 watts over threshold. Sterling was screaming now, the audio clipping. You are going to blow up. Back off. Back off immediately. Julian reached up to his chest. He found the radio wire. The wind talks. The radio just chatters. He yanked the earpiece out. It dangled against his jersey, Sterling's tiny, tinny voice shouting into the void. Julian looked at the summit, 10 miles away. He wasn't racing the other riders anymore. He wasn't racing the clock. He was exploring the limits of a new reality, one where steel and carbon had a soul, and he was just the pilot. He accelerated again. And the scary part was, it was easy. The air at 9,000 feet was not air, it was a thin, cruel gas that tasted of copper and pine resin. Julian Vance was no longer riding a bicycle, he was strapped to a ballistic missile that was slowly, methodically dissecting his cardiovascular system. The peloton was a memory, a colorful smear of liquor left miles down the mountain in the heavy, oxygen-rich atmosphere of the valley. Up here, above the tree line where the granite bones of the Rockies poked through the thin skin of the earth, there was only Julian, the black ribbon of asphalt, and the silence of the Velocite X9. He was in the red line. In the parlance of professional cycling, the red line is that razor-thin margin between sustainability and biological collapse. It is the place where lactate floods the muscles faster than the blood can scrub it away, turning quads into stone. It is the place where vision tunnels, where the periphery turns gray, and the only reality is the patch of road 3 feet in front of the front wheel. Usually, a rider visits the red line for seconds, an attack, a sprint, a desperate bridge. To stay there is suicide. To live there is impossible. But Julian had been living there for 20 minutes. He should have blown up. His body should have engaged its fail-safe governors, shutting down power to the legs to preserve the heart. But the bike wouldn't let him stop. The machine beneath him, tuned by the ghost of a garage mechanic, felt less like a collection of carbon and gears and more like a conduit. It was pulling the effort out of him, demanding it. The golden oil on the chain had eliminated the friction of metal, leaving only the friction of his own will. The wrong, spoke tension that Klaus had wanted to fix was singing a harmonic note that resonated in Julian's shin bones, a vibration that felt like a chant: push. Pull. Push. Pull. Inside the Aerodyne team car, following 100 meters behind, the atmosphere was one of terrified awe. Marcus Sterling sat in the passenger seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the dashboard. On the laptop screen balanced on his knees, the telemetry data from Julian's bike was streaming in via the long-range transmitter. It was a cascade of numbers that defied the logic of physiology. "He is holding 410 watts, Sterling whispered, his voice cracking. "He has been holding 410 watts for 18 minutes at altitude. His heart rate is 192. That is 4 beats above his theoretical maximum." "The sensor is broken," Klaus said from the back seat, though he didn't sound convinced. He was staring at the drag coefficient numbers. "Look at the yaw angle. The wind is hitting him at 30 degrees, but the bike is stabilizing. It is shedding the turbulence. It is acting like a sail. He's going to die, Sterling said, reaching for the radio handset, forgetting that the wire dangling from Julian's jersey meant the line was dead. He's going to stroke out before the summit. Nobody rides this deep for this long. But Julian wasn't dying. He was evolving. Or perhaps he was hallucinating. Hypoxia is a powerful drug. As the oxygen starvation gnawed at his brain, the world began to warp. The cheering fans lining the roadside, screaming, shirtless men in Viking helmets, waving Colombian flags, began to blur into streaks of color, like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. The sound of their cowbells, usually a deafening cacophony, receded into a dull roar, like the ocean in a shell. In that quiet, Julian realized he wasn't alone. He looked down at his shadow on the asphalt. The sun was high and to his left, casting a sharp, elongated silhouette of the rider and the machine. But for a fleeting, terrifying second, the shadow didn't look like him. The shadow wore a chaotic, flapping jersey, not a skin-tight aero suit. The shadow's hair was wild and loose, not tucked under a helmet. The shadow was pedaling with a different rhythm, a slow, mashing grind of the big gear, the style of the hard men of the 1960s. Heels down, boy, a voice rasped. It wasn't in his ear. It was in his head. It was the voice of Miller. Julian blinked, shaking the sweat from his eyes. He looked at his feet. He had been pointing his toes, a modern habit. He dropped his heels. Instantly, the glutes engaged. The power transfer shifted from the burning quadriceps to the massive, fatigue-resistant muscles of the posterior chain. The bike surged. It was a microscopic adjustment, a change in leverage that no wind tunnel computer could have calculated, but it unlocked a reserve of energy Julian didn't know he possessed. "Don't fight the grade," the voice rasped again, sounding like gravel crunching under tires. "The mountain isn't your enemy. The mountain is just the floor. Dance on it." Julian let out a ragged breath that sounded like a sob. He was crying, he realized. Tears were mixing with the sweat, streaming down his dusty face. He wasn't crying from sadness, he was crying from the sheer, overwhelming intensity of the sensation. He had spent his entire career treating the bike as a tool, a thing to be beaten into submission. He had treated his body as a battery to be drained. Now, for the first time, he was part of a complete circuit. The man, the machine, the road, the wind, they were all bleeding into one another. He passed the 1 kilometer to go banner. The gradient kicked up to 14%. This was the wall. This was where Quintana usually launched his killing blow. Julian risked a look back. Far down the twisting serpent of asphalt, he saw the chase group. They were tiny figures, wrestling their bikes, their shoulders rocking with exhaustion. Quintana was there, his face a mask of agony, his mouth a gaping black hole. He was suffering. He was fighting gravity. Julian turned back to the front. He wasn't fighting gravity. He was negotiating with it. The tape over his computer was peeling slightly in the heat, revealing the corner of the screen. He saw a number flashing, 195 BPM. His heart was vibrating in his chest like a trapped bird. His vision was narrowing to a pinhole. The red line was no longer a line, it was a vast, red ocean, and he was drowning in it. "Just listen to the hub," Miller's ghost whispered. "Silence is speed." Julian closed his eyes. It was madness to close his eyes on a climb, but he did it. He listened. Under the roar of the blood in his ears, he heard it. The hub. The chain. The lack of grinding. The pure, liquid silence of the Velocite X9. It was a lullaby. It told him that the machine would hold. It told him that the wrong tension in the spokes was absorbing the micro-vibrations that caused fatigue. He opened his eyes. The summit banner was there. A white arch against the brutal blue sky. He didn't sprint. He didn't throw his hands up in victory. He simply rode through the line, his face expressionless, a man who had seen the other side of the veil. He had taken the king of the mountains. He had put a minute and a half into the world's best climbers in 10 miles. But the race wasn't over. Now came the other side of the coin. The descent. Wolf Creek Pass drops 4,000 feet in 12 miles. It is a terrifying chute of hairpin turns, off-camber sweepers, and cracked pavement, often with no guardrails between the white line and a 1,000-foot drop. It is a test of nerves, physics, and tire contact patches. Julian crested the top, grabbed a newspaper from a spectator, an old-school trick to block the wind on the chest, and stuffed it under his jersey. He zipped up. The sweat on his skin instantly turned to ice as the wind chill hit. He tipped the bike over the edge. Gravity, which had been his enemy for the last hour, now became his violent lover. The speed built instantly. 30 miles per hour, 40 miles per hour, 50 miles per hour. This was the moment Sterling and Klaus had feared. This was the moment the loose spokes and the eyeballed alignment would be tested. A rigid wheel is predictable, it tracks true until it loses grip, then it snaps away. A soft wheel is an unknown variable. Julian approached the first hairpin. It was a tight, decreasing radius right-hander. The warning signs flashed yellow. Brake! Sterling screamed in the car behind him, watching the brake lights of the team car illuminate as the driver slammed on the anchors. He's coming in too hot. He's going to overshoot. Julian didn't touch the brakes. He set up the turn. He shifted his weight to the outside pedal. He leaned. Usually, a bike at this speed fights the lean. The gyroscopic force of the wheels wants to keep it upright. You have to muscle it down. But the Velocite X9 fell into the turn with a terrifying eagerness. As the lateral G-forces built up, compressing the tires into the tarmac, Julian felt something impossible. The wheels shifted. The lowered tension in the non-drive side spokes allowed the rim to deflect slightly, just a millimeter. Instead of skipping over the ripples in the pavement, the chatter that sends a rider into the guardrail, the wheel molded itself to the road. It bit into the asphalt like a claw. The bike didn't feel rigid. It felt alive. It flexed. It absorbed the energy of the turn and stored it. Julian's knee hovered an inch above the pavement. He was taking the corner at 55 miles per hour, a speed that should have sent him sliding into the oblivion of the canyon. Trust her, the voice said. Julian released the handlebar's death grip. He guided with his hips. He hit the apex. Now came the exit. As he straightened the bike, the stored energy in the flexed wheel released. The bike didn't just straighten up, it shot out of the corner. It was the slingshot effect Miller had hinted at, the dynamic return of energy that the rigid, factory-spec wheels couldn't provide. Mein Gott, Klaus whispered in the team car, watching the gap to Julian open up. The team car, a BMW with sports suspension and racing tires, was squealing its tires to keep up. The bicycle was leaving them behind. The cornering speed. He is defying the coefficient of friction. He's not braking, Sterling said, his eyes wide. He's not braking for the sweepers. Julian was in a trance state now. The suffering of the climb was replaced by the hyperfocus of the descent. The world was coming at him at 60 miles per hour. The wind roared like a jet engine, tearing at his jersey, hammering his helmet. But the bike remained silent. No death wobble. No shudder. Just that eerie, fluid stability. He saw a patch of gravel in the middle of the next turn, the nightmare of every cyclist. There was no time to correct. If he hit the brakes, he would high-side. If he swerved, he would lose traction. He braced for the impact. He hit the gravel. Crunch. The bike twitched. A rigid bike would have transmitted that shock to the handlebars, causing a tank slapper. But Miller's tuning, the breath he had put into the headset, the give in the spokes, swallowed the shock. The bike shimmied once, a fluid ripple like a snake moving through grass, and then found its line again. Julian laughed. It was a manic, breathless sound torn from his throat by the wind. He was descending faster than he had ever dared in his life, and he felt safer than he did walking down the street. He was flying. He was plummeting toward the finish line in the valley below, a black missile guided by the hands of a dead man. But as the altitude dropped and the air grew thicker, reality began to bleed back in. The adrenaline spike of the descent began to mix with the crushing fatigue of the climb. His arms were shaking. His neck ached from holding the tuck position. And then, he felt it. A subtle vibration in the rear wheel. It wasn't a mechanical failure. It wasn't a loose nut. It was a change in the song. Ping. Ping. The sound of a spoke detensioning. Julian's heart stopped. The wrong tension held perfectly under the compression of the corners, but the constant thermal expansion of the brakes on the rim and the brutal forces of the descent were starting to unravel the delicate equilibrium Miller had created. The magic was finite. The soul of the bike was holding on, but it was straining. He had 5 miles left. A long, straight run in to the finish line. The vibration grew. A shudder ran through the saddle. "Hold on," Julian whispered to the machine. "Just hold on." He looked down at the top tube. He could almost see the old man's greasy fingerprints still there, faint on the clear coat. The team car radioed him again, Sterling's voice cutting through the wind noise, seemingly realizing Julian couldn't answer but hoping he could hear. "Vance. You have a 2-minute gap. But we're seeing an oscillation in the rear hub telemetry. The wheel is losing structural integrity. Slow down. You have the win. Just bring it home safe. Slow down." Julian looked at the road ahead. The finish line banner was visible in the distance, a tiny speck. He could slow down. He could coast. He could win safely. But that wasn't the deal. Miller hadn't tuned the bike to be safe. He had tuned it to be free. "Ride it like you love it," Miller had said. "Not like you're trying to conquer it." Julian didn't sit up. He didn't reach for the brakes. He tucked deeper. He brought his chin down to the stem, his nose touching the cycling computer with the black tape. He spun the gear, pushing the speed to 70 km per hour on the flat. The wobble in the rear wheel became a rhythmic thump. Thump thump thump. The bike was shaking now, dancing on the edge of instability. It was crying out, just as Miller had said it did before. But this wasn't a cry of pain. It was a cry of effort. It was the machine giving everything it had, stripping its own bolts to get him to the line. "Come on!" Julian screamed, his voice raw. "Come on!" He flew under the 1-kilometer banner. The barriers were a blur of noise. The crowd was screaming, pounding on the advertising boards. The rear wheel slipped sideways, a terrifying skip on the pavement. Julian corrected with a flick of his hips. The bike held. 500 meters. The vibration was violent now. The silence was gone, replaced by the rattle of carbon shaking itself apart. 200 meters. Julian sat up, grabbed the drops, and sprinted. It was reckless. It was stupid. It was beautiful. He crossed the line. He didn't post up. He didn't celebrate. He crossed the line and immediately stopped pedaling. He let the bike coast, the momentum carrying him through the throng of photographers. As he slowed to a walking pace, the rear wheel let out a final, loud ping, the sound of a spoke nipple snapping. The rim rubbed against the brake pad, bringing the bike to a wobbly, grinding halt. Julian unclipped and put a foot down. His legs collapsed. He fell onto the hot asphalt, gasping, staring up at the sky. The bike fell beside him. He reached out a hand and rested it on the frame. It was vibrating, hot to the touch, like a horse that had been ridden to exhaustion. "Thank you," Julian whispered. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he was talking to the bike, or the man who had fixed it. The chaos that follows a victory at the Wolf Creek Classic is a violent, sensory assault that stands in stark contrast to the solitude of the climb. Julian Vance lay on his back on the scorching asphalt of the finish area, his chest heaving like a bellows, staring up at a sky that seemed too blue, too vast to be real. The world was a cacophony. The roar of the crowd, the aggressive shutter clicks of 100 cameras, the distorted booming of the PA system announcing his record-breaking time, it all washed over him like a tide of static. He felt a hand on his shoulder. It was a soigneur, shoving a bottle of recovery mix into his face. Then came the frantic grip of Marcus Sterling, the team director, shouting something about history and contract bonuses. But Julian couldn't hear them. His ears were still tuned to a different frequency. He was listening for the hum of the bike. But the bike was silent. He pushed himself up to his elbows, ignoring the screaming protest of his quadriceps. He looked for the Velocite X9. It was gone. Two officials from the Union Cyclist Internationale, UCI, wearing blue blazers that looked absurd in the mountain heat, were already wheeling it away toward the technical tent. The rear wheel wobbled pitifully with every rotation, the broken spoke clinging to the rim like a severed tendon. The magic was broken. The golden chariot had turned back into a pumpkin of carbon fiber and epoxy. "Wait," Julian croaked, trying to stand. "Be careful with it." "Standard procedure, Mr. Vance," one of the officials barked over his shoulder. "Mechanical doping check. Routine for the winner." Julian slumped back down. Let them check. Let them tear it apart. They wouldn't find a motor. They wouldn't find a battery. They would find only the ghost of a touch they couldn't quantify and a physics they couldn't calculate. The technical tent was a sterile, white-walled enclosure that smelled of ozone and suspicion. The Velocite X9 hung on a stand, stripped of its wheels, looking vulnerable and exposed. A portable X-ray scanner, a massive, humming beast of a machine, was slowly traversing the length of the frame, peering through the layers of carbon weave to expose the hollow insides. Julian sat on a folding chair in the corner, wrapped in a towel, shivering despite the heat. Sterling paced back and forth like a caged tiger, while Klaus, the head mechanic, stood by the monitor, biting his fingernails. "Well?" Sterling demanded, stopping in front of the lead commissaire, a stern Frenchman named Dupont. "You've scanned it 3 times. You've swabbed the chain. You've checked the bottom bracket density. What did you find? A fusion reactor? A jet engine?" Dupont looked up from his tablet, his expression a mixture of frustration and bewilderment. He took off his glasses and cleaned them slowly, a stalling tactic that drove Sterling mad. "Nothing," Dupont said. "The frame is empty. No motors. No magnetic arrays. No hidden energy storage. So he's cleared," Sterling exhaled, the tension draining from his shoulders. "We won. It's official." "He is cleared," Dupont conceded, but he didn't step away from the bike. He walked over to the rear wheel, which was leaning against a table. He picked it up and spun it. The broken spoke flailed. "But this is disturbing. The tension on this wheel is atrocious. It violates every safety standard in the book. And the hub bearings. They are running with almost zero resistance, yet there is no grease. Just this." He rubbed his finger on the cassette, coming away with a faint smear of the golden residue. "It smells like a forest." Klaus stepped forward, his ego bruised but his curiosity piquing. I told him the tension was wrong. But the data, Monsieur Dupont. We tracked his descent. He cornered at forces that should have caused a tire roll-off. The wheel. It adapted. It makes no sense. Sterling's eyes lit up. The fear of disqualification was gone, instantly replaced by the avarice of commerce. He looked at the bike not as a vehicle, but as a patent. It's a new tuning protocol, he lied smoothly. Aerodyne proprietary technology. Dynamic tensioning. We've been developing it in the wind tunnel. Julian stood up. The towel fell from his shoulders. He walked across the tent, the cleats of his shoes clicking sharply on the metal floor plating. He moved between Sterling and the bike, placing his hand on the top tube. "No," Julian said. Sterling blinked. "What do you mean, no?" "It's not proprietary technology," Julian said, his voice quiet but echoing in the small space. "And we didn't develop it in a tunnel. An old man in a shack did it with a crescent wrench and a bottle of oil." "Julian, shut up," Sterling hissed, grabbing his arm. "Don't give away the IP. We can replicate this. Klaus, get the spoke tension meter. Measure every nipple on that wheel before we rebuild it. We need to map the exact torque values. We can sell this. The Vance tune. It'll be worth millions." Julian looked at Klaus, who was already reaching for his tools, eager to dissect the miracle. Then he looked at Sterling. He saw the numbers in their eyes. Watts. Dollars. Margins. They saw the result, but they were blind to the process. They thought they could reverse engineer a soul. "You can't map it," Julian said. "It's physics, Julian." "Everything is mappable," Sterling scoffed. "It wasn't physics," Julian replied. "It was listening. He didn't tune the wheel to a number. He tuned it to the vibration of the day, to the heat, to me. If you try to replicate these exact tension numbers on another bike, on another day, it won't work. It'll just be a loose, dangerous wheel." He grabbed the handlebars. "Nobody touches this bike. Retiring it. As is. You can't retire a prototype." Sterling shouted. "We need the data." "You have the win," Julian said, his eyes hard. "You have the trophy. You have the headlines. But the bike is done. It gave everything it had. Look at it." He pointed to the frame. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, they looked closer. Around the bottom bracket, the paint was spider-webbed with microscopic stress fractures. The carbon hadn't failed, but it had aged. The wrong setup had allowed the bike to perform beyond its limits, but the cost was the machine's structural life. It had burned itself out to get him to the line. "It's dead, Marcus," Julian whispered. "It's a wall hanger now. Let it rest." Sterling stared at the stress fractures, the evidence of a mechanical effort that bordered on the supernatural. He slumped, defeated by the reality of the material. "Fine," he muttered. "Fine. But you're doing the press conference. And you're wearing the sponsor cap." The sun was setting by the time Julian escaped the media circus. He didn't go to the team dinner. He didn't go to the massage therapist. He grabbed the keys to a rental truck, loaded the broken, silent Velocite X9 into the back, and drove away from the resort. He didn't drive toward the city. He drove west. The adrenaline of the race had faded, replaced by a profound, hollow exhaustion. But it was a good hollow. It was the feeling of a vessel that has been emptied of everything it was carrying, leaving space for something new. He drove for 2 hours, watching the landscape shift from the jagged peaks of the Rockies back to the high desert scrub of Nevada. The air grew warmer, drier. The stars began to puncture the twilight sky, vast and indifferent. He found the turnoff by memory. There were no GPS coordinates for a feeling. Route 66 was empty. The asphalt was still radiating the day's heat. He slowed the truck as the familiar, dilapidated silhouette of Miller's Fix and Go rose from the gloom. The closed sign was still there. The windows were still boarded. But there was a light on in the side yard, a single, bare bulb hanging from a string. Julian pulled in. The gravel crunched under his tires, a sound that made him flinch, reminding him of the gravel on the descent. He killed the engine. Silence rushed back in, reclaiming the space. He stepped out. The air smelled of sage and old dust. I wondered if you'd come back. The voice came from the shadows near the porch. It was the woman, Sarah. She was sitting on a plastic garden chair, a cardboard box on her lap. She looked tired, her face drawn, but her eyes held the same piercing blue spark as her father's. I won, Julian said. It felt like a stupid thing to say. It felt small. I know, Sarah said. She nodded toward a portable radio sitting on the porch railing. We listened. The announcer said you descended like a man possessed. Said you defied gravity. Julian walked over, leaning against the hood of the truck. It wasn't me. It was him. It was the bike. It was both, Sarah corrected gently. Dad always said a bike is just a pile of pipes until the right person gets on it. He said the magic happens in the middle. She stood up and walked over to him, holding the cardboard box. I finished clearing out the shop today. Most of it is going to the scrapyard. The tools. I sold the big ones. But I found this in his workbench. Top drawer. Under his tobacco. She handed him a small, leather-bound notebook. It was stained with oil, the corners rounded and frayed from years of being shoved into pockets. Julian took it. His hands were shaking slightly. He opened the cover. The pages were filled with diagrams. Not the clean, CAD-generated schematics of aerodyne, but hand-drawn sketches of suspension linkages, spoke patterns, and frame geometries. There were notes scribbled in the margins in a cramped, spiky handwriting. Tension is fear. Let the wheel breathe. The chain wants to be liquid. Grease is a prison. Pine oil and lanolin, the old receipt from 1954. The rider fights the wind because he thinks the wind is hate. The wind is just air in a hurry. Teach them to shake hands. Julian turned the pages, reading the philosophy of a man who had seen the world through the tip of a screwdriver. It was a Bible of mechanical empathy. He watched you, you know, Sarah said softly. On the TV. Every race. He used to yell at the screen. Look at him, he'd say. Shoulders up to his ears. He's riding like an accountant. He needs to loosen up. Julian smiled, a genuine, painful smile. He told me I was suffocating the engine. He liked you, Sarah said. He didn't fix that bike because you were famous. He fixed it because he saw you walking. He said, that boy is too proud to hitchhike, but too stupid to carry water. He's got the sickness. The sickness? The need, Sarah tapped her chest. The need to go fast. To suffer. Dad had it too. That's why he quit the Olympic team. He said they stopped caring about the ride and started caring about the medal. He came out here to fix tractors because tractors don't lie. But he missed it. I think fixing your bike was the last fun thing he did. Julian looked at the dark garage. He could almost hear the clank 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 of the wrench, the phantom sound of industry. He realized that the 5% performance gain hadn't come from a magical adjustment. It had come from a transfer of passion. Miller had poured the last of his own sickness, his own love for the machine, into the Velocite X9. He had given Julian his final ride. I want to do something, Julian said. I want to restore this place. Or. I don't know. A scholarship? A mechanics school? Sarah shook her head. Let it go, Julian. That's what he would have wanted. Places like this. They have their time. Then they become dust. That's the way of the desert. She reached into the box again and pulled out a small, amber glass vial. But he made a fresh batch of this before he passed. I think he intended for you to have it. It was the oil. The smell of pine and earth hit Julian instantly. "The 5%, Julian whispered, taking the vial. "Use it sparingly," Sarah smiled, a sad, sweet expression. "And for God's sake, learn to true your own wheels." 6 months later. The morning mist was lifting off the Blue Ridge Mountains, thousands of miles away from the Nevada desert. The air was crisp, smelling of damp leaves and autumn decay. Julian Vance stood by the side of the road. He wasn't wearing the neon yellow and black of Team Aerodyne. He was wearing a plain black wool jersey and simple shorts. There were no logos. No sponsors. He wasn't riding the Velocite X9. That bike was hanging on the wall of his living room, broken and beautiful, a relic of a perfect day. Instead, he was straddling a steel frame. It was a custom build, painted a deep, metallic blue. It was heavier than his race bike. The tubes were round. The cables were external. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small amber vial. He uncorked it and carefully applied a single drop to each roller of the chain. He spun the crank. Whir. The sound was soft, organic, a whisper of acceptance. He put the vial away. He checked his handlebars, tilted up just slightly, a few degrees, wrong, by modern standards. He plucked a spoke. Ping. It wasn't tight. It sang a low, mellow note. Julian clipped in. There was no cycling computer on the handlebars. No heart rate strap constricting his chest. No power meter in the crank. He pushed off. The bike accelerated. It wasn't the explosive, rocket ship stiffness of the carbon race machine. It was a surge, a springy, lively response that felt like a conversation. The steel frame absorbed the hum of the road, transmitting a warm vibration into his hands. He picked up speed. The wind rushed past his ears. For years, Julian had ridden to chase numbers. He had ridden to hunt down seconds, to murder watts, to conquer gradients. He had ridden to silence the critics and satisfy the sponsors. But as he leaned into the first corner, feeling the tires bite, feeling the wheel flex just enough to hold the line, he realized he wasn't chasing anything anymore. He closed his eyes for a brief second, letting the sensation wash over him. He wasn't the World Tour champion. He wasn't the asset. He was just a boy on a bike. He listened. The wind whistled through the vents of his helmet. The tires hissed on the damp tarmac. The chain hummed its silent, oily tune. Right there, the wind seemed to say. Right here, the steel replied. Julian smiled, dropped his shoulders, and opened his lungs. He didn't know how fast he was going. He didn't know how far he would ride. And for the first time in his life, it didn't matter. He just rode. And the ghost of a mechanic, somewhere in the great, silent garage of the universe, finally put down his wrench and watched him fly.